Hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Kowalski, and I am here with the invention of Hugo Cabret. Um, when we last left off, we were in the process of reading chapter 5, Hugo's father. This one was all about Hugo's father and the automaton. Chapter 5 is super long, so that's why I figured we would finish that and then go on to chapter 6. So when we last left off, Hugo's dad and Hugo himself were just like, couldn't stop thinking about that automaton and fixing it. The last line we read was, but even as he worked in his shop, Hugo's father must have kept thinking about that automaton. And this was the picture that we looked at, right? So soon, Hugo's father had filled several notebooks full of drawings, with drawings of the automaton. He opened the automaton up and carefully disassembled it. He drew detailed pictures of all its parts, and then he cleaned them and patiently began to put it all back together. On Hugo's birthday, his father took him to the movies, as he usually did, and he gave him one of those notebooks as a present. That's why that notebook was so important to him. Meanwhile, Hugo's father grew obsessed with getting that automaton to work. He brought Hugo back to the museum a few more times and explained how the mechanisms operated. They remained optimistic that it could be fixed, and they talked about what the automaton might write once it was working again. Hugo and his father began to think of the automaton as an injured animal that they were nursing back to health. One night, the old guard in the museum forgot that Hugo's father was up in that attic, and he locked the door. This trapped him inside. Hugo had no way of knowing what would have happened next. No one knows how that fire started, but it rushed through the whole building in minutes. Hugo stayed up all night waiting for his father to come home. He had never been this late before. But when the door finally opened in the morning, it wasn't Father. It was Uncle Claude. Pack your things quickly, nephew, Uncle Claude said. Uncle Claude lifted his tiny steel spectacles in one hand and wiped his bloodshot eyes with the other. Your father is dead, and I am your only living relative. I'm taking you in. Hugo, who hadn't slept all night, barely understood what his uncle was saying. He remembered hearing the blood beating hard in his ears like the rhythm of a clock. In a trance, he put his clothes into a little suitcase and packed some of his tools and deck of cards. He slipped his father's cardboard notebook into his pocket. As they walked through the freezing streets of the city, his uncle explained about the fire and the locked door. Hugo wanted to fall over, to just lie down on the sidewalk and disappear. This was all his fault. He had wanted his father to fix the machine, and now because of him, his father was dead. You'll be my apprentice, he vaguely heard his uncle saying as they kept walking. You'll live in the station, and I'll show you how to care for the clocks. Apprentice's timekeeper, that's a good title for a boy, and besides, I'm getting too old to be climbing through the walls. Now we get why he's climbing through the walls. A million questions floated through the fog in Hugo's mind, but the only one that he finally said out loud was, What about school? Hugo's hand was still wrapped around the notebook in his pocket, and absent-mindedly he began to rub the cover with his finger. His uncle laughed. Nephew, you're lucky. You're finished with school. There won't be time for it once you're in the walls of the station. You should thank me. Uncle Claude slapped Hugo on the back and said, You come from a long line of horologists. Your father would be proud. Now hurry up. Uncle Claude cleared his throat. The word horologist had been painted on the door of his father's shop, and Hugo knew that it meant clockmaker. And he had always thought he would be a clockmaker like his father, but after the discovery of the automaton, he began having other ideas. He wanted to become a magician. Hugo began to think about running away, but at that moment, as if reading his mind, Uncle Claude grabbed the back of the boy's neck and didn't let go until they reached the train station. And so, Hugo began working all day in the dark on the clocks. He had often imagined that his own head was filled with cogs and gears like a machine. He felt a connection with whatever machinery he touched. He loved learning how the clocks in the station worked, and there was a kind of satisfaction in knowing how to climb through the walls and secretly repair the clocks without anyone seeing him. But there was hardly ever any food to eat, and Uncle Claude yelled at Hugo. He rapped his knuckles when he made mistakes, and he forced him to sleep on the floor. Uncle Claude taught Hugo how to steal, which Hugo hated more than anything in the world, but sometimes that was the only way he could actually get something to eat. Hugo silently cried himself to sleep most nights, and he dreamed of broken clocks and fires. Soon Uncle Claude began to disappear for hours at a time, leaving Hugo to take care of the clocks twice each day, all by himself. Sometimes his uncle did not even return until really late at night, and then one day, Uncle Claude didn't come back at all. Hugo was afraid that his uncle would track him down if he left, but finally, on the third night that his uncle didn't return, he decided to escape. He packed his things, he raced out of the station. He was hungry, he was tired, he had no idea where he would go. He made his way through the narrow city streets, turning blindly, terrified he'd freeze to death before he found shelter. He looked down at his feet. He walked because the wind were bitter, and he eventually found himself, quite by accident, in front of the ruins of the burned-down museum. Was it an accident? All that was left of the building was a jagged brick wall with nothing behind the windows but black sky. The police had put up wooden barriers, but no one had begun to clean up the place. A huge pile of twisted metal, wooden planks, crumbled bricks lie in front. And then something in the wreckage caught his eye. There it was, like an accusation, reminding Hugo that everything in his life had been destroyed. He sat down and stared at it. A long time had passed. Dogs barked in the distance, and the rumblings of the street cleaners pierced the quiet of the night. Where was Hugo supposed to go? What was he supposed to do? He had no one. Even the automaton was dead. He gathered up his few belongings and walked away. But he kept looking back at that ruined machine. For some reason, he couldn't leave it there. After all of his father's hard work, the automaton belonged to him. Hugo took a deep breath. He went back. He cleared the charred debris. The automaton was heavy and in several pieces, but he picked it up, and not having anywhere else to go, he returned to the train station. It was a difficult trip back with his belongings slung over his shoulder and the blackened, twisted remains of the automaton straining his arms and back. He didn't even know what he was going to do with this thing once he got it back to his room. Since it was late at night, he managed to drop it inside one of the air vents without anyone seeing him. It took several trips through the walls to get it all back to the room. When he finished, his hands were scratched pretty badly, and his arms and his back ached. Hugo laid out all the pieces on the floor, washed his hands. He washed his hands in the basin by the bed, which he refilled from the spluttering sink in the tiny kitchen. He stared at all the misshapen pieces of metal, and he was thankful that his uncle hadn't returned. Fix it. Hugo jumped. He could have sworn he heard a voice whispering in his ear. He looked for his uncle, but the room was empty. Hugo didn't know if it was his own thoughts or if it was a ghost, but he heard it clearly. Fix it. Looking at the automaton, Hugo didn't think he'd be able to do it. I mean, it was in far worse shape than before, but still, he had his father's notebook. Maybe he could use his father's drawings as a guide to rebuild the missing parts. Increasingly, Hugo felt like he had to try. If he fixed it, At least he wouldn't be so completely alone. Hugo knew it would be dangerous to stay at the train station. His uncle could come back at any moment. And in the meantime, he was sure if the station inspector knew that he was there alone, he'd be locked up in that little jail cell in the office and then sent off to an orphanage. Then the automaton would probably be thrown away or destroyed. Hugo quickly realized he had to make it seem like his uncle was still around. That's why he's so nervous around that station inspector. He would keep the clocks running as precisely as possible, and he'd take his uncle's paychecks from the office when no one was looking. He really didn't know how to cash them, but most of all, Hugo would do his best to remain invisible. 3 months had passed since then. Hugo ran his fingers along the arm of the automaton and gazed at the face. He had studied the drawings in his father's notebook closely and had made great progress. He had repainted the face himself, and it had the strangest expression. It reminded him of his father, and the way he always seemed to be thinking of 3 things at once. The newly polished wooden hand was now poised above the desk as it once was, waiting for Hugo to make a new pen. Hugo had continued thinking about the note that it would eventually write. And the more he worked on the automaton, the more he came to believe something that he knew was completely crazy. Hugo felt sure that the note was going to answer all his questions and tell him what to do now that he was alone. The note was going to save his life. Whatever he imagined the note, he always saw it in his father's handwriting. Maybe Father, while he had been working on that automaton in the attic of the museum, maybe Father had changed the little mechanical parts just enough so it would make a new note. One meant just for Hugo. It was possible, after all. Now he just had to get that notebook back from the old man so he could finish his work and read that message from his father. And that is the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is called Ashes. Can you see that? It's a little bit of a glare. Ashes. So we will continue with the story of Hugo Cabret. I wonder what kind of fight that old man is going to give him to get that notebook back. I wonder if the girls are going to help him. I wonder if she was lying. I wonder if Hugo can do it without even having the notebook. I wonder. Anyway, we will meet back and continue reading. Hope you enjoyed.